Hello, I'm Colleen Gallagher, CEO at OnWrd and UpWrd, and you're listening to the Association Insights podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started.
Hey there, it's Colleen Gallagher, your host of Association Insights. Today's episode is a special replay of our summer LinkedIn Live Roundtable, Communicating What Matters, How Associations Can Lead with Strategic Storytelling. In today's high-stakes environment, the way your association communicates can make or break your credibility, influence, and member trust. I got to sit down with two powerhouse comms leaders, Tim Ebner from the Can Manufacturers Institute and Sean Luechtefeld from ANCOR, for a really candid conversation about navigating polarized issues, amplifying member stories, and leading through complexity with clarity. If you're a comms pro, a CEO, or a policy lead, this one is packed with practical takeaways you won't want to miss. So let's get into it. Welcome everyone to this rendition of our live virtual roundtable for Association Insights. This one is Communicating What Matters, How Associations Can Lead with Strategic Storytelling. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Colleen Gallagher, CEO of OnWrd and UpWrd, and the publisher and host of Association Insights. In today's environment, the way associations communicate can either strengthen or stall their influence. From polarized landscapes to crisis moments, strategic storytelling, it's mission critical more than ever. I'm really excited to be joined by two absolute powerhouse communicators leading this work every day. We've got Tim Ebner, VP of Comms and Marketing with the Can Manufacturers Institute, and Sean Luechtefeld, VP for Membership and Comms at ANCOR. I've had the pleasure of knowing both of them for some years now and got to serve on an ASAE Communications Advisory Committee with them as well. They're both extremely smart, savvy communicators, and I'm really appreciative of them giving their time for this conversation today. I know it's something a lot of you are grappling with. We really encourage you to ask questions, hold your own conversations within the comments. You'll see Christine Stay from the ONU team will be in the comments chatting a bit as well. And she's going to be sending me your questions. So we'll make sure to check in on those as we can and grab a couple of them at the end too. We really want to focus as much time as possible on our conversations today, but want to make sure you get to know each of our panelists first. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, their role, their organization, a little bit about their background, and the key focus they're bringing to today's conversation. Tim, let's start with you.
Great. Well, thanks, Colleen, for putting this together. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Tim Ebner. I am the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the Can Manufacturers Institute. We represent metal can manufacturers in the United States, as well as its suppliers. And right now, our key issue we're focused on is the ongoing tariffs issue, impacting our industry specifically and impacting many U.S. manufacturing sectors. So we'll hopefully talk a little bit about that today, in addition to some other topics, which we do a lot of work in sustainability and recycling as well. As a career, though, my background is as a working professional journalist. I've spent about the last decade of my career working at various media organizations, including The Atlantic, Education Week, and most recently for Associations Now, which is part of ASAE. So it's great to be here, and I'm really excited for the conversation.
I'll echo Tim's gratitude for Colleen and say thank you so much for putting this together and for your kind words. I am Sean Luechtefeld. I have the pleasure of serving as Vice President for Membership and Communications at ANCOR. Unlike Tim's association, my association is not necessarily obvious in disclosing what it does, but we are the American Network of Community Options and Resources. We represent about 2,500 different organizations that deliver community-based services to folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they can live more independently and in their own homes and communities, rather than being institutionalized, which is too often the case still here today. Given the work that we do as an association, our focus has primarily been on the fight over Medicaid that has been taking place over the course of 2025 through HR 1 and beyond. The vast majority of our members get the vast majority of their funding through Medicaid. although people typically think of that as a health insurance program for low-income households, it is also something that provides long-term care and support for people with disabilities. That was actually the original sort of purpose when the Medicaid program was established in 1965. But we know that the funding cuts that were passed in H.R. 1 and signed by the president a couple of weeks ago will have a significant impact on those services in a variety of different ways. And so obviously we spent a lot of this year focused on how do we make sure that those cuts don't come to fruition or don't come to fruition in their worst possible iterations. And now that some of those cuts have come to fruition, we're really looking at what it means for providers and how do we sort of balance making sure that on the one hand, our members know what's at stake and are prepared to respond, but on the other hand, don't lose hope about the ability to deliver better services to more people. So certainly a timely issue and one that I look forward to diving into a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, guys. I'm really excited for this conversation. And Sean, let's stay with you here. So, when the stakes are high, which I mean, when are they not anymore in this world? But
Yeah.
whether it's politics, policy, public pressure, you name it, how do you lead your comms efforts without compromising credibility or core values? Because I think that's a big question hitting a lot of association professionals right now.
Yeah, I think that it is such a delicate dance, right? And there's so many different components that go into it. I think for us, the real important part of it starts with the perspective that we have, which is that we fancy ourselves as the big tent, or sometimes we talk about it as the constructive center. There is a tension within our industry, even though I don't typically think about human services in terms like industry. But within our space, there is this tension between maintaining the status quo. And I think that's born of a genuine desire to keep people safe versus really pushing the envelope and being progressive, not in the political sense, but in the sense of, really kind of pushing the bounds of what it means to ensure people are included in their communities. And so, in order for us to sort of hold up the big tent and occupy that constructive center where there's space for everyone, but we're always pushing forward, we really have to focus on listening and making sure that we are understanding the different perspectives and the different ways that policy and regulation are impacting providers' ability to support people. Oftentimes we might think that a regulation is going to have one impact, but in reality, the set of other regulations within a state might mean that providers experience things completely differently. And there's not necessarily one size fits all approach. And so we're often really looking at sort of what is the no wrong door approach to understanding sort of where our members' needs are. And then we use that to invite them to tell their stories, to contribute perspectives. And we really see ourselves as the amplifiers of those stories. It's not us that are the ones kind of on the front lines, but we can play an important role in sort of giving a megaphone to the issues and making sure that people are paying attention when it can sometimes feel like no one else really is. And then I would say that the other part of it is really about making sure that you have the right stakeholders at the table. So I have a rule that even if our CEO signs off on something, or even if I sign off on something, that we can't be the only pair of eyes. And especially when it comes to the biggest issues, it's about making sure that we have buy-in from our senior leadership, from our executive team, but also from the people who might not necessarily hold that position of authority, but who are fundamentally responsible for ensuring that we are being good stewards of a message that takes into consideration the various perspectives that our members hold.
Yeah, that's so smart. I think the biggest takeaway for me though is going back to that amplifying. Like you're the amplifiers. I love that perspective and thinking through there. Tim, I'd love to know more about your approach on this front.
Yeah, I think Sean has great insights here in listening first. I think with our main issue that we face this year with metal tariffs, We were one of the first industries to be tariffed by President Trump and his administration. We started preparing for this, though, previous to the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum that went into effect back in March, and have since doubled as of June. So I think what we have tried to do all along the way is gather our members and hear from them first so we can best understand the impacts that they're up against when it comes to the manufacturing of steel food cans, which, Americans reach for and use every day in their pantries for cooking at home, or aluminum beverage cans, which are, essential and sustainable options for consumers each and every day. But I really do think that we put together a task force with members that really listened to them first so we could understand the impacts that they were up against. And this tariff issue is not a new issue for us. Under the first term of President Trump, we saw metal tariffs go into effect. So we actually had some hard data that we could speak to in terms of the direct impacts to our US manufacturing sector. And I can't understate that enough, not only listening to your members, but also being the association that gathers the data points so that you can then relay it onwards to members of the media or to tell your own story, whether you're doing that through digital or social. One of the big impacts we have seen so far is food cans, which are made of a specialized steel called tin plate steel. It's really only a niche segment of overall steel production. So it's 1% of global production overall. And it's primarily imported into the United States. We did have tin plate steel tin mill lines back prior to Trump's first term with tariffs. We had about 12 lines open, and now to this date, we only have 3 in the United States. So we were able to tell the impact of the tin mill steel dynamics and the production domestically through our impacts to metal tariffs. And I think what's so important is you have to come to the table with some of those key talking points and statistics so you can really speak to impact overall. We rely on our trade allies for a lot of our imports of tin plate steel, and it's going to remain that way. We do not produce that here domestically. And so we had to tell that story so the general public and the administration understands the pressures that we're up against when it comes to tariffs.
Yeah, the data, that's everything. I think that's so amazing that you were able to take that. And I also think when we're in this polarized world we're in, and you might have members that could fall on both sides of an issue, the data lets you just say, here you go. This is why we're taking this position, and makes it a lot easier on that front too, for sure.
Yeah, and I think another thing here too is really describing or telling to the why it matters. Your data is only as good as explaining the why. And so I think like it's always great, and associations I think always come to the table with a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics, but it's really getting down to the why it matters. We had to be able to tell the American public why we don't domestically make tin plate steel in the United States. We also then had to explain, costs that are being passed along in the supply chain as a result of tariffs, ultimately resulting in inflation on grocery essentials. That impacts a lot of Americans, but specifically, it impacts the most vulnerable Americans in the United States. We know that SNAP recipients rely on canned foods to put dinner or meals on the table. And so we had to explain also the impacts of tariffs as it relates to dollars and cents for Americans nationwide.
Yeah, that's huge. I'm curious, like in that vein, so you're obviously communicating more publicly and educating, but when you guys are talking to your members, I mean, us as communicators, we're used to absorbing all kinds of news. And I think even us right now, we can get overwhelmed by everything that's out there. So how do you keep your members informed without overwhelming them, without losing control of the narrative, of the message? What are you doing on that front?
I'll say, from my perspective, there's kind of 2 key components to this. I think the first is exactly what Tim is picking up on, which is, stories on their own are incredibly powerful. Data on its own can be incredibly powerful, but it's the combination of those things together that we find to be truly transformative. The data to be able to say, this problem exists at a certain scale and is deserving of public policy attention, but also that there's not just hordes of people who are experiencing this that are abstract and sort of hard to understand. that there are real human beings, real families, real people. In Tim's case, it might be the family that relies on SNAP in order for their nutrition, and they're not able to access affordable food, not because the food itself has gotten more expensive, but because the packaging has gotten more expensive. I mean, that's just absurd, right? So I think that there's really powerful stories to be told, and then pairing that with data can help people understand that, that family's experience is not an isolated one. The other piece of it, and this is something that I really try to do, and I think ANCOR has gotten better over the years at doing, which is ensuring that there are a multitude of different media formats for any one particular message. So, with all of the updates that have been going on around the fight around Medicaid cuts, especially in the couple of weeks leading up to the passage of the bill, right? You had the Senate version that came out, and it was significantly worse than the House version, even though we thought that the Senate was going to moderate that legislation. Then the Senate ended up making a number of changes before it passed its final version, and then it went back to the House, where we expected that there might be some changes, but there weren't. At every turn, there was a different expectation that was violated, right? And throughout all of that, we really combine our weekly policy update newsletter, which is called Capital Correspondence, messages to what we call the ACC, the ANCOR Connected Community. It's our version of Collaborate if you're an ASAE member and you're familiar with that platform. We have weekly policy briefings every Friday at 12:30 where people can dial in on their lunch break and listen to what's going on, and kind of get up to date that way. We have members only town halls where people can, speak their concerns and ask questions. And, some members are going to take advantage of some of those things, and others of them are going to choose different ones. Our expectation is not that every member is going to like read everything and listen in on everything and attend everything, but rather recognizing that different people have different learning styles and people fit their information consumption into their life in different ways. And so choosing different opportunities and different avenues for reaching them has been really critical, especially at a time when we're no longer just competing against the few newsrooms that, cover our issues, right? People are getting information from podcasts and from each other, and from social media in ways that mean that we need to be able to differentiate what we're offering. And so part of that is by offering different formats and information. And then part of that is by making sure that we are adding to the conversation and helping to provide that analysis in a way that makes it accessible to folks who may not necessarily be well versed in Medicaid policy generally, but there is this one piece of the pie where they really have to be experts in order to stay ahead of the curve.
I would also add, I think Sean hit the nail on the head here, but I do think thinking and acting like a journalist. Associations, I don't typically think of themselves as journalists, but when you take the skill sets and mindsets and approaches of being a reporter, it really is being able to synthesize down on your issue, use simplified language in order to explain that complex issue, and then tell that story across multiple mediums to multiple audiences. And so I think when you get inside of that mindset and you have sort of a journalist mindset to your association, you're then able to not only connect in with the right audiences, but make further reach on your messages and make sure they're resonating. I think your best advocate in your corner has to be your members. All along this way with us with the tariff issue, we've worked hand in hand with our members who are the subject matter experts. I am certainly not a trade policy expert or an expert in, manufacturing, but our members are. So we rely on them. We use their voices, and frequently they are the ones that are sitting for interviews, talking about the impacts to U.S. manufacturing, or even getting journalists inside some of their manufacturing centers so that they can actually see the process of how a can is made, or even just understand the supply chain dynamics. It really is essential. And I think having your members at the table partnering up with them, making sure they're the voice of the industry is really essential when you're dealing with a news story that's fast breaking. To me, the biggest challenge right now is that the tariffs issue seems to be changing by the day. And I like to call it tariff whiplash. Like, you'll read a story on a Friday and then you'll go to bed, and Saturday it'll be a completely different story the next. So making sure you're also thinking critically, you're not being too knee-jerk reaction to a news story or headline, but bringing your members in along the process will really help guide you through those news cycles and those situations that you're up against.
Yeah, I I love everything about the focus on the members. I think any association I see succeed on this front, they're doing the things both of you guys said. They're communicating well to their members, making sure they understand in the craziness of it all. They're letting members be the advocates. I think that's all spot on. Before we move on to our next segment here, we polled the audience on their number one challenge their team is facing it when it comes to strategic comms. So I want to share the top two answers to kind of frame the lens of our next piece here, but cutting through the noise with our message and getting people to understand how to compose their story. So I think those are two really common, challenges. I'm not surprised to see those bubble up to the top. And in our world of associations, more than anywhere, I think communicators are facing nonstop demands. I don't know that that's even new. I remember when I first started on that ASA committee, it was like we were doing something out of the pandemic on burnout, and it was that, okay, well, we've all been burned out for a long time in the association world, but when you look at media, executive visibility, member updates, there's a lot association communicators need to do. So where should association comm leaders really prioritize in that strategy, and what's okay to let go too? Tim, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we actually, coming into this role about a year ago, I was working in member communications directly with, so many different newsletters that we had, giving members updates on policy issues, on association updates, on just critical information they needed to know. What I realized is we were just giving them way too much information. I like to, it's literally TMI, too much information. And I think in our digital environments that we all live in now, you do have to repeat your message and retell it. I say you have to say something 3 times before a member actually internalizes it and hears it and agrees or gives you feedback to it. But I think that what we were doing wrong was we were giving way too much information, providing way too heavy of an in-depth readout. And so what I ended up doing was using what is very common now, which is a smart brevity format. It's popularized in Axios and other news networks, but we really did distill down to the why it matters and what's coming next, kind of key prompts for my team to use in terms of updating our members. And that really moved the needle. It really helped keep our members informed on key issues. It really helped increase our, open rates and our click-throughs on our content. But I think we're applying some of this like simplification across the board when it comes to our web content, when it comes to our newsletters, our social strategy. We're a small staff association. There's only 7 of us staff wide. So we realize and recognize that we cannot do it all, but we do use this kind of overarching theme of don't make me think, or let's keep it simple so that we can really help our members make the strategic analysis or make the strategic decisions. I think when you present information to your members, you like to oftentimes go overboard, but that can really result in, I think, fatigue and sometimes paralysis. And so one of my overarching themes and goals as the leader of comms here at Can Manufacturers Institute is to really implement a process of simplification. That doesn't mean we're necessarily like dumbing down the information, but we're giving the most essential information over to our members or over to the public so that they can understand the issue that might be quite complex, but can be broken down into parts and pieces and can hopefully be better understood.
Yeah, I love that. Sean, over to you. What are your thoughts here?
I think all of that is really good advice. And, I think about, we don't do exactly the smart brevity format, but I think about 3 years ago, we began tweaking the way that we frame all of our action alerts. So we do a lot to mobilize advocates to speak out, not just on, HR1 or any of the other legislation that's been happening this year, but that's always kind of been in our DNA. The public policy work that we do is the number one reason why our members join us. And then once they're sort of in, there's a whole host of other things that sort of keep them here. And when we uh, kind of revised the format of those action alerts, it was really to focus almost on, I think of it as like what, so what, and now what, but it's really putting the ask front and center and then providing just enough detail to where if they didn't want to read anymore, they could go do the action, but then still accommodating the people who want the really detailed information by offering that, but putting it at the bottom. What we had used to do was give all of this background and all of this context and all of this information that isn't unimportant, but it's going to be important to some folks much more than others. And so we were risking losing people in that conversion funnel when we weren't prioritizing the information and literally saying, here's what we want from you, here's why it matters. And if you want to learn more, here's what to know. And I think that was such a small tweak, but it not only had a really positive impact on the number of people who were taking the actions that we were putting out. I mean, I'm really proud that so far this year we've been able to mobilize more than 90,000 advocates who have sent more than 125,000 messages to members of Congress since the beginning of this year. But it's also given us a different way of thinking about some of our other messages. And I think the realization that I've really come to in the last several years is it's no longer about deciding what we're going to say to our members or what we're going to choose to talk about. We have to talk about it all, but we don't have to say it to everyone, and we don't have to say it with the same level of detail. So one of the things that I've been really laser focused on is figuring out how to do a more advanced job of segmenting our audiences so that we are only sending a webinar about compliance to the people who have indicated that they're interested either in webinars or compliance, right? And not assuming that our entire mailing list is going to be interested in that. Likewise, we're using some automated campaigns to help drip the sort of information about how to take advantage of their member benefits so that way they don't have to have their inboxes clogged with that all the time, but we push it out to them periodically just as sort of reminders. So that way, when we do have to send things to our full list, we can do that in a much more thoughtful way. That also includes giving people more flexibility and more choice when it comes to their preferences, both when it comes to email, but also when it comes to the discussion forum posts and things like that. There's a lot of different ways that we've implemented that, and what that looks like in your association might differ. But the idea being that we do have to talk about compliance, and we do have to talk about Medicaid cuts, and we do have to talk about the access rule, and we do have to talk about sub-minimum wage requirements. But we don't have to say every single one of those things at a full, deep level of detail to every single person. And so we've really been thinking about how do we empower our members to craft their own member experience so that they're getting the information that is most relevant. And what that might mean is that fewer people receive information about X, Y, or Z, but they're more likely to engage with it, which is obviously a win for us. So thinking differently about that and not trying to pick and choose between issues or strategic priorities.
Yeah, that's really smart. I think what stands out to me that both of you guys hit on is at one point you listened to member feedback and you changed what you were doing because of it. And I know that seems so obvious, but I actually think it's really rare. I think a lot of times in associations it's, well, this is how we do it, or, well, they don't know what they want. But you saw a need that wasn't being fulfilled, you changed it to make things better, and then the data showed that it was performing better. So that's really phenomenal, I think, and great changes to make on that front to make lives easier too. One thing that I think is a big part of all of this prioritization is a lot of times with various stakeholders having a say in things in associations, whether it's staff departments, it's Tim, you have a small staff, so maybe it's your board or maybe a member committee, but how do you decide which moments are worthy of this full scale comms plan and which aren't, and how do you communicate that?
Yeah, I'll start as a small staff association. I like to say we're a fully horizontal organization in that, with seven of us, we have to work together collaboratively almost every day. It kind of removes the hierarchical structures that I feel like a lot of traditional associations have. But that can also come as a challenge. And I think, when you're called upon to put together, say, a communications plan to a issue that's quickly moving or fast breaking, it can feel almost overwhelming. I also think that we've moved ahead as technology tools have developed for us to say that we can rely on technology to help craft some of these baseline programs and functions. And so when I think about putting together a communications plan, sometimes my first stop will actually be using an AI tool to help me formulate that plan. I don't work with, many marketers or many comms folks. It's literally just me in my department. And I don't even call myself a department because I think I do many functions beyond communications. But I do think that there are technology tools out there that can help you quickly formulate something like a communications plan these days. And that is great because it might not be perfect, but it is a baseline from which you can build and develop something further. I also like to say that a communications plan is only as good as its use and if it's put into use. I see a lot of associations develop them, put them on a shelf, and then they just really silently die. So I really advocate for having something that is live, dynamic, and functioning. Our team uses a lot of collaborative project management type tools for communications plans, which I think is different from maybe how traditional comms teams work, in that it relies on a factor of, okay, we have to do this work because it's time to this date or it's time to this action. So using project management tools, using AI tools, I think these are all things that can help you maybe step up your game when it comes to something like formulating a communications plan. And you can do that if you're a big team. You definitely need to do that, though, if you're a small staff association.
Yeah, I want to plus one 100 times because we are, I guess, compared to seven staff, we are not quite that small, but we have 19 members of our staff, which probably feels huge to folks who work for smaller associations, but I promise it doesn't feel huge to us. And it also doesn't feel huge, in the context that I started in my role about 7 years ago, and at the time we had about 1,400 members and 14 staff. And now we have more than doubled, but in terms of the number of members that we're serving, but we do not see a doubling of our staff resources. And so it's always, I think, a question of like, how do you make sure that you're focusing your attention in the right places and being okay triaging and saying no. And I think one of the most helpful ways to do that is to get clarity on the front end of what your objectives are. And I don't just mean in a really generic sense of like, well, we want to advocate for positive policies that help shape the well-being of people with disabilities. What I mean by that is getting really clear on what your communications and what your messaging needs to accomplish. So after the election, when it became clear that there were going to be efforts to try to cut Medicaid as a way for paying for, extensions of tax cuts and things like that, we collaborated, and by we, I mean the communications team and the government relations team, collaborated in a number of different ways. But one of the things that we really focused on was a communications plan that would sort of give us the playbook for, because we didn't know what flavor the cuts might come in, and we didn't know exactly how they were going to be introduced. Would it be done through legislation? Would it be done through a series of 77 different executive orders? Right? We kind of had to be prepared for anything, but that often means like preparing for nothing. So we came up with what we called the three imperatives, and those imperatives sort of became the criteria by which we evaluate this exact question of like, do we need to put out a statement? Do we need a communications plan? Do we need to mobilize members? Do we need to, engage with the media, right? And the imperatives were essentially one, cultivate, educate to cultivate a series of disability champions on Capitol Hill, because unfortunately, a lot of the folks that we had championed on both sides of the aisle had lost reelection. so we needed a new bench of people who were going to be cheerleaders for our policies. The second imperative was to ensure that members of Congress understood that cutting Medicaid would be politically poisonous to them, that their constituents were going to hold them accountable for ensuring that they maintained access to their healthcare and their services. And then three, more internally focused, we wanted to make sure that our members were aware of everything that we were doing on their behalf. Even if we were ultimately unsuccessful, we felt like it was critical that our members understood along the way the efforts that we were taking to protect them and to protect their ability to continue delivering those services. And so when you have three clear imperatives like that, then it becomes really easy not only to identify, okay, does this warrant a communications plan, but to ask more granular questions like, is there a media play here? And if so, are we going to be doing targeted pitches to reporters, or are we going to be doing a opinion writing campaign and trying to get our members to place letters to the editor? Are we going to make this a member-focused message, or is this going to be a more public-facing message that we will then point back to in our member-facing communications? Right? Those are questions that are a lot harder to answer if you don't have that clear sense of whether or not the effort is going, because we're not looking at like, will it make a difference in the policy, right? Telling our members that we're going to, do X, Y, and Z doesn't change whether or not Congress is going to pass $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts. But what it does do is help us understand what is the role that we have to play and how do we differentiate that role from what others in the space might be doing.
Yeah, what an awesome set of guardrails to just focus you right away on, okay, this matters. So now here's what we can do next, and to put you in a place that it just makes it a process and makes it so much easier to handle. I love that. We got a comment from the audience from someone with the National Asphalt Pavement Association. I think you'll both really resonate with. So he said, similar to what Tim said about tariffs, when it comes to legislative and regular policy, it's knowing when to communicate. So with the constant changes, the impacts and next steps can be frequently unknown and unsettled. Not communicating can create a void, but that often means we're left with some version of, what are we saying? Is it providing any value, or are we just filling the void and waiting for things to settle? Have you guys felt that in some of your efforts?
I mean, yes. I mean, hello. It's like being inside of a trade association daily almost. I think one of the biggest challenges, say, like a government affairs person or policy person is up against is sometimes that decision maker, that audience is literally just one person. Like that one person will ultimately decide if your issue wins or if it fails. And so, in addition to what Sean was saying, I think a lot of times what we start our exercises off with or our planning for policy issues is really just around like a framework, kind of like his imperatives approach. And I think sometimes we'll even get down to like the three people in the room we need to influence on this issue. And then we'll build a set of frameworks around them, really empathizing with them. So we call it like an empathy-based goal approach, but it's what do I want them to think? What do I want them to feel? And what ultimately do I want them to do as the course of action? When you start to do that and think specifically on a narrowed target audience for like a policy issue, you can then also do some stakeholder mapping of, okay, who are, the networks around this person, or what type of media are they consuming and reading on the daily? It helps you build an understanding and an approach to reaching that person directly. And I can say like it does come down to timing. Timing is so important in all of this. I think specifically on the tariffs issue, that has been key and critical to me and my understanding as we've gone along on the issue. Knowing when to speak up and what to say has been the most essential. And I think you have to have kind of both the analysis of really good data and insights from like a media monitoring perspective, knowing what's being said and reported out in the press, but then also keeping in touch with your members throughout the process so that they can also give you information that I think will be helpful to knowing when the right moment arises for when you need to speak up and say something.
Yeah, I would add to that, like, much more simply, you don't want to walk away from the fight feeling like you didn't lay it all out there, right? There are 100 things that you might do and they may have zero impact, or they might have impact and you'll never know what that impact is. Uh, but that is always going to feel better than looking back and thinking, well, if only we had taken the opportunity to mobilize our members to do this. Or, well, if only we had thought to execute a wider scale media strategy, right? Obviously, there are resource constraints and things like that. But if you've done everything you could possibly do, then you're going to look back and say, well, some of these things were more effective than others, and that can inform the approach that we take moving forward. But it's always better to be in that position than to be in the position of saying, well, we had choices A, B, and C. We could have done two of the three, but we only did one, and that one didn't work, right? And I think, with all of this, there's obviously the big picture. There's like, did we educate people about tariffs such that some of those tariffs got walked back? Or did we do enough to educate lawmakers about the valuable role that Medicaid plays for people with disabilities? But then there's also the impacts of all of our work that are a little bit less tangible, but equally or sometimes even more important. One of the messages that we pushed out to our membership after the passage of HR1, which I genuinely believe is true, is that we may not have been able to fully fight against all of the Medicaid cuts that had been proposed, but we've built relationships with lawmakers that will serve us well into the future. To Tim's point about being able to target the individual members of Congress or the individual folks in the administration that will actually move the needle. Susan Collins was one of the people that we had very much been aware that if there was going to be a chance to block any of that, she was going to be one of a small handful of senators that were going to be critical to that. And not only did Senator Collins vote against that bill when it passed the Senate, but she also introduced an amendment that would have added funding for disability service providers because of the relationship that we had cultivated along the way. And that is something that we not only are going to be able to recognize, in future advocacy with Senator Collins's office, but it's also something that means that now Mainers with disabilities and the service providers who support them can continue to build their own relationships with her in recognition of the fact that these are issues she has now gone on the record as caring about and indicating are important to her. So oftentimes you've got to look back and sort of say, what are the things that we can derive from this, not to be naive or optimistic when it might feel like there's not a lot of room for that, but to be able to say, what was the good that could come out of an otherwise bad situation?
Yeah, that's so interesting. What a great example. I think that's fascinating. And it really segues well into our next segment here, which is about storytelling. So Sean, I want to stay with you. Obviously, everyone talks about storytelling. You hear it all the time how important it is, but it's not just a buzzword. It's literally your reputation.
Yeah.
What do you think are the most effective ways you've seen associations or you yourself have used content campaigns, executive comms, you name it, to really lead from the front? What's working?
I mean, I think it goes back to one of the things I said at the very beginning, which is really taking the time to listen to what your members are experiencing and being willing to amplify that message using whatever platforms that you can. So I think like, outside of the context of the work that I do, I think you see really excellent examples of this in ASAE's Cold Circle Awards. But I think, stories um, that really sort of honor the perspectives and the experiences of the people that are impacted. And uh, even though I don't always feel like it's such a luxury to do work that is so high stakes for people because it literally is life or death in some cases, I feel incredibly fortunate that those stories are always sort of at the ready. So I know that I can reach out to my members and say, hey, like, give me an example of somebody that you support who has experienced X, or give me an example of how the long waiting lists for services in your state is negatively impacting, people who maybe you're not serving because they don't have the ability to enroll in services. And with all of that, I think it's then taking that to tailor it to the formats that you have access to. So a good example of this is we had been talking for a long time about the significant challenges that disability service providers face during natural disasters. And we had been working with one of our leaders in Louisiana who was talking about how Medicaid in that state really puts a lot of requirements in place for what providers have to be able to do if there's a hurricane and a loss of power, for example, but they don't actually fund any of those things. So you have to have all these generators. You don't necessarily have the money to buy them. And so we had kind of been, cultivating those stories and kind of hearing from our members about them. And then it just so happened that a reporter had recently posted on LinkedIn saying that she was interested in looking at the ways in which natural disasters and climate change were disproportionately impacting people with disabilities. So having that story at the ready and knowing not only from the provider's perspective, but also the perspectives of the people that they support, that we could go straight to that reporter and say, here's somebody to get in touch with, meant that there was ultimately some really compelling reporting that came out of it that shed light at a really timely moment here as we're kind of seeing hurricane season on the upswing. Now we can start to say, look at this issue and look at how important it is that providers have the resources that they need to be able to support people, especially considering that these instances are happening more frequently.
Yeah. Tim, how do you feel about this?
Well, Sean, I think that's a great example to provide, and I think example of how you're like thinking and acting like a journalist. In my opinion, right now, news media is at an all-time critical like level of under-resourced, understaffed. I'm frequently amazed when I come into a conversation with, say, like the national reporter on trade policy or the national reporter on recycling and sustainability. Like they just aren't briefed up yet on your industry or your issue. And so part of our role as associations is to be that thought partner and to be that trusted confidant to that reporter so that they can quickly understand the issue at hand and you can provide them with fact-based, transparent data. So just cannot stress that enough. And so when you as an association are thinking and acting like a journalist, I like to think that you're partnering and being oftentimes their best advocate to information and resources. When we look at other issues aside from tariffs, we work a lot in bottle deposits, which are a recycling reform effort that help increase the volume of aluminum beverage cans. We also work with extended producer responsibility policy in states across the country to help reform recycling and hopefully increase recycling rates overall. We really do take this approach. We not only tell policymakers what they should be doing when it comes to making sure these policies, comprehensive recycling, gets passed, but we also show them examples of how we can do this. So sometimes if you as an association can show rather than tell, that's oftentimes going to be the most effective way to get your policy issue across the finish line. And just as an example, most recently, we timed an event to America Recycles Day, which happens annually. So that's November 15th, and it's an evergreen moment where we know media and press will be covering recycling heavily and focused towards it. We went into states that are underserved by recycling access, and we worked with our partners to establish drop-off center sites for recycling in communities where there is virtually no access or limited access to recycling. And so we started this program. It's called Cans for Cash, where communities can gather up their material, drop it off at one of our centers, and actually receive cash payouts for the aluminum cans that they recycle. And we wanted to show that rather than tell why recycling matters. We have a material that is easily recyclable. Metal is recyclable infinitely, and if put in the recycle bin, it can get back to a new can in less than 60 days on average. So we wanted people, rather than that telling those statistics, to really show a program in action. And by us investing in communities, showing how it works, we specifically chose rural communities where there's a lack of access to recycling. And we chose communities specifically in states where there is not comprehensive recycling policy, in the state legislature, so that their governors, their state senators, their House reps can look at it, notice it, and pay attention to what's going on in their own backyards.
Man, what a smart campaign. And the show don't tell, if I could like that 1,000 times. I mean, that is where it's at, and it is truly like how it works to get your message out there and to have it resonate. We're getting close on time here, but before we get to our lightning round, I do want to get your guys' take on this. So, in the corporate world, especially, we're seeing and hearing that it's not just a company people want to hear from. They want to hear the CEO or the leader's point of view and wants to hear them speak out too. So, in the association world, I want to know what you guys think. What role should leadership visibility play within your comm strategy?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, we were interestingly impacted by a leadership transition recently, which is a great thing. But it happened right in the middle of sort of our biggest issue, which was tariffs. And we had an outgoing president who was very much a trade policy expert, was a very well-trained, could talk to the trade matter at hand in an expert fashion. But at the same time, we had a transition process, a planned transition. And so I think that really pushed me in my leadership capacities to become someone who could talk to our trade matters specifically when it came to tariffs. So that's a new thing that I was uncomfortable with. It's something that I had to do media training for. It had to keep me focused on my messaging and how I communicate. But I look at every challenge as an opportunity. And so in this transition, I not only helped media train our new leader, our new president, but we used it as an opportunity to say, let's find opportunities for your voice to be the spokesperson for our organization, recognizing that we weren't doing that before. It also helped us resource share, recognizing that we're a small staff association. So when you're inundated with media requests and it is that moment, it's the moment because your phone is basically ringing off the hook and every cable news network is calling you. So what better way than to train multiple staff members to be leaders on behalf of your organization and effectively be the spokesperson for that? And so that resulted in me being on CBS News for the first time and being a talking head, which was a new experience for me. But I think an opportunity based out of a challenge, which we looked at and used as a way to move forward. And so now we're really thinking about our media relations strategy in a new way where we let our executive leader speak from their position, but we also allow our staff members to be the spokespeople to carry the message forward as well.
Yeah, I love any opportunity to humanize the brand and let people know that there are real human beings behind the thing that might otherwise just kind of seem like a machine. And so I think from that perspective, leadership visibility is a great way of doing that. I think at the same time, it's critical to be mindful of the reality that leadership comes in a lot of different forms, and it doesn't have to be somebody who has the title of CEO or president of the board of directors who can, really be passionate, effective, eloquent spokespeople. And so even though the desire for more leadership visibility often comes from a desire to hear from the CEO. I think that is one important voice, but cultivating more of those voices, like Tim is saying, and being willing to train them and support them is really critical. And I think that's especially true both when you think about different levels of experience within the organizations that your association serves, but also in the sense of the folks who might traditionally be overlooked and not really thought about as leaders. One example, that comes to mind for us is, direct support professionals are the folks on the front lines who are actually delivering the services. They are often thought of the front lines, but they're not the people that you think of when you think about healthcare heroes or essential workers, right? They're not nurses, they're not clinicians, but they are playing a critical role in the ability of people with disabilities to live independently and in their communities. And so we've actually just launched a DSP ambassador program, which is designed to cultivate their skills as spokespeople so that when we have members of the press calling us up, or when we have congressional staffers asking us for stories, that we have the ability not just to go to the CEO or the president of an organization, but also to the people who might be the lowest paid within that organization, but who are doing some of the most important work. And so I would just encourage folks as they think about leadership visibility to uh, pursue opportunities to bring more of a human voice, but to be mindful about the different perspectives that you're spotlighting when you do that.
Yeah, Sean, I love everything about that. We have a client in the mental health space that therapists are their members, and they had a really big goal of elevating that type of therapist, their profession. And they took that approach exactly with us. And it wasn't the CEO, that was the spokesperson. And what was great is we had this huge bench of therapists in all different expertises. And with mental health being so prevalent in conversation and there being so many different things to talk about, they're in the news every single week now. It's just
all the time.
It really changed how they could speak to things by putting the people on the front lines out there. So I love that thought of who is leadership and how do we show leadership, because that can change your whole approach and it can really, really create a winning strategy. So I think that's phenomenal advice there. I want to get into our quick fire round here and put you guys on the spot because I'm asking you to answer this in one sentence, but
Sure.
What is one thing every association should do to communicate more clearly and credibly in the year ahead?
I can start. I think you need to bring your communications team to the table in executive meetings, in government relations meetings, in policy meetings, even if you just have one person there so that they can hear and understand the discussion that's going on. Without that connection, you're basically flying blind and you're not leading as a whole team. And so I think making sure your comms person is at the table when these member meetings are happening and when these discussions are taking place is essential.
Okay, I wish I had said that one. But since you said it, then I have a good excuse to say what I was going to say instead, which is check your assumptions about what you think you already know, both to uncover the things that you're wrong about, and there are going to be things you're wrong about, especially if you work in an industry that's always changing and evolving, just like communications is always changing and evolving. But it will also uncover the things that you're right about, and that some of your tried and true methods really are still tried and true and worth pursuing. But I think when there has been so much change and so much disruption, challenging those assumptions and questioning what you think you already know is so critical.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Sean and Tim, I swear I leave every conversation with the two of you feeling like I learned something, like I'm smarter. So thank you. I so appreciate you sharing all of these amazing insights today. And for everyone tuning in, let's keep this conversation going. You can follow OnWrd, UpWrd, and Association Insights on LinkedIn. We have a podcast, we have videos, newsletter. So whatever you like to consume news from, we can share it that way. And don't forget to connect with our panelists on LinkedIn. So we'll drop their LinkedIn handles in the chat, but they're both, as you see, incredible resources for navigating today's comms challenges. But again, thank you guys, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association Insights podcast, previously known as the Association 100 podcast, is a production of OnWrd and UpWrd Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of our newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association? Or do you have some words and wisdom from the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupwrd.com. That's info@onwrdupwrd.com. Be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association insights and inspiration. Thanks for tuning in.